Hello everybody and welcome to this video where I'm going to analyse the poem Extract from the Prelude by William Wordsworth. So this is going to be a very long video. It's going to hopefully tell you everything you could possibly need to know, but I will recommend that you pick up Mr. Bruff's Guide to My Last Duchess and Other Poems, as this ebook at mrbruff.com contains all of the notes written down and typed up about everything I'm about to talk about, because else you're going to watch this video and be furiously scribbling for hours. And this is a growing ebook, okay? So every time I do one of these poetry analysis videos, I put the notes in this and update the ebook and email all the previous customers with the updated edition. So it's only available at mrbruff.com. Pick up a copy and it'll help you. You can just read along as we go through. So let's have a look at this poem. Now, to begin with, as always, we look at the poet. We don't just want to cover lots of biographical detail, though. We want to think about the biographical details that seem to be important to help us in our understanding of the poem. So William Wordsworth was born in Cumberland in England in 1770, and the main thing to know about him was that his early life was incredibly depressing. He had a very troubled relationship with his father. His father would often work away, and he was delighted when he did, because William really didn't get on with his dad. And he also had a really difficult relationship with his grandparents and uncle on his mother's side. They hated him, and the feeling was mutual, I think. Now, tragically, both of his parents died before William had reached his mid-teens, and after his parents' death, William and his siblings were split apart and sent to live with different relatives. It would be 9 years before he saw his beloved sister again. Now, to add insult to injury, William was sent to live with the uncle and the grandparents that he so hated. And he found himself living in Penrith in the Lake District, spending most of his time outdoors to escape those relatives that he so disliked. They treated him so badly that he actually said that he considered committing suicide. So he spent his days outside of the house, essentially exploring the countryside, and this began his relationship with nature, a relationship which would grow over his lifetime. As a child, he just enjoyed exploring nature. But as an adult, he felt that nature could communicate to you and teach you important things about life and philosophy. And we see all of that in this poem. He was an early supporter of the French Revolution, but actually later on, as the French Revolution developed, he was moved away from it. He was disillusioned with the violence and the chaos that was part of the sort of latter stages of the French Revolution. And he is what is known as a romantic poet. I'll talk about that in a second. And later in his life was appointed poet laureate, although was much like Tennyson, it was felt that he had written most of his brilliant poetry before this point as a child. So he was poet laureate, but most of his brilliant poetry was in the younger part of his life, as we'll see with this poem. So let's have a think about the context of the poem itself. It's quite a tricky one to get your head around, because we are studying an extract, a part of a poem, which is in itself taken from the Prelude, or Growth of a Poet's Mind, an autobiographical poem. Now, the Prelude is the first part of an intended 3-part epic poem titled The Recluse. Now, as it happens, William Wordsworth never finished the poem, although the prelude itself runs to almost 400 pages in total, so it's a huge poem. He began writing it in 1798 when he was 28 years old, and continued working on it for his entire lifetime, but he never actually published it. It was only when he died in 1850 that his wife published the poem. And as I said, it was part 1 of a planned 3-part poem. He only ever wrote part 1 and part 2. Now, in terms of the prelude itself, the wider poem, the format followed in the entire poem really is to present an experience from Wordsworth's past, and then to explore its philosophical importance, relating it to both nature and wider society. Wordsworth described the theme of the poem as to present views on man, nature, and society. So in this video, and the analysis that I'm going to present of this poem, these are the themes I'm going to explore. What does the poem tell us about man and society, and what does the poem tell us about nature? And we're going to explore those themes through the three areas of study: language, structure, and form. And as you probably know if you watch my videos, most people are able to analyze language. The more sophisticated analysis comes through looking at structure and form, so that's where I will begin when we move on to the detailed analysis. Now, the genre of the poem is Romanticism. Romanticism is one of those things where you can study it for days, but I want to kind of cover as a GCSE student, what do you need to know? Today we look back at Wordsworth and think of him as one of the first generation of Romantic poets. Now, Romanticism is very complex, and to understand Romanticism we need to understand what went before it, which was the Enlightenment. And Enlightenment poetry, 1650s to 1780s, focused on realistic poems which instructed people. This was a time of scientific developments and rationalism, and the French Revolution itself was influenced by the Enlightenment, with its overthrow of the monarchy and striving for political freedom. Wordsworth himself, as I said, was an early supporter of the French Revolution, but as it devolved into bloodshed and chaos, that brought home the evil of mankind, and society was all of a sudden very aware of the innate evil in us as humans, and suddenly it was no longer popular to write poetry which criticised society. It was felt that any poetry which sort of promoted any kind of uprising should be squashed down, and a shift was needed to move away from this, and this is where Romanticism came in. So as a result, as a kind of a direct opposition to Enlightenment poetry, Romanticism was developed, and it really focused on the power of the imagination. It returned to the power of the imagination in poetry. For your notes, you might think of these three things: a dislike of urban life and an embrace of the natural world. And that, in many parts, was a sort of result of a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. Number two, a love of the supernatural, and number three, the use of ordinary everyday language. And of course, these three elements can clearly be seen in extract from the Prelude, so it is a romantic poem. Not only does the whole poem take place in the countryside, there is also a supernatural element to the description of the power of nature, and the language is almost entirely ordinary and everyday. In fact, the language is so simple that this is the first video that I've analysed a poem where I don't really need to give a line-by-line translation of what each line means. On the whole, it's very easy to understand. But let's have an overview of the poem. So the extract that we're looking at is often referred to as the boat stealing episode, and it describes a true story that took place at Ullswater. So have a look at this map, courtesy of Google Maps. Of course, the roads are added now, might not have been there at the time, but this is interesting about helping us set the geographical location. Here in Cockermouth is where Wordsworth was born. When his parents died, he moved over here to Penrith to live with the grandparents and uncle that he so disliked. Both of those locations, though, surround this big green area that you see on screen, the Lake District. And this was the passionate sort of stomping ground of Wordsworth. He loved the countryside here, and the poem that we're looking at takes place here on this area, this lake, Ullswater. Okay, so it's a true story, took place at Ullswater. That's the second largest lake in the Lake District, and it tells the story of Wordsworth as a young boy stealing a rowing boat and rowing out onto the lake, and what begins as essentially an exciting joyride soon turns nasty as Wordsworth fixes his eyes on a huge mountain which springs into view the further that he rows, and terrified he turns and heads back to the shore, harassed for days by the memory of the event. Now, this picture on screen, rather excitingly, is actually the lake itself, and I think it shows us probably the exact place where Wordsworth was rowing. So if we have a look at the picture, the idea behind the poem, because it's quite hard to understand unless you know a bit about rowing, is that, let's say Wordsworth took the boat here and he was rowing out to here, and when you row facing backwards, so you fix your eyes on a place that you're going to row to, and you row and you're looking backwards. So he was looking at, say, this part here, which he refers to as the craggy ridge, and then as he gets a bit further out, let's say to here, his view changes and he can see beyond what he thought was the kind of final peak here, the sort of end of the high ground. He sees this big mountaintop, this cliff face, and it scares him. And a lot of this sort of fear is metaphorical, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But that's the literal what happens. He takes the boat out, he's looking at this spot here, thinking it's the kind of limit of what he's looking at. As he gets further out, he realizes that what he thought was the top is actually not. He sees this huge cliff face, gets scared, turns around and rows back again, and can't sort of stop thinking about it. So that's the story of the poem, and I think that's important to explain because I think with the rowing ideas it can be a bit confusing. Now, despite the seemingly unimpressive plot then, this poem is actually, in terms of form, an epic poem. So do you remember I said we need to study language, structure and form? This is the analysis of form. And a lot of things that take place in this poem and a lot of things that are going on are because it's an epic poem. So you should write about epic poetry in your exam if you can find a good moment to do so. So epic poetry is a form of poetry full of exciting adventures and heroic feats. In an epic poem, the speaker tells a long story about heroic acts. Now, mostly those heroic acts are legendary or historical, and the poem is based on one main hero. Now, classic examples of this form of epic poetry would be Paradise Lost by John Milton. That's 1667. This is a poem of over 10,000 lines which tells the story of Adam and Eve's temptation and fall. And this poem is a huge influence on the Prelude and, of course, as an extension of that, the extract from the Prelude. And we see a lot of Milton kind of influence in the poem. So that's important to note. But of course, if we look at this definition of epic poetry, there are some challenges to defining the Prelude as an epic poem. In epic poetry, there's usually one major event. So in Homer's The Odyssey, that would be Odysseus's homecoming. In Paradise Lost, it's the fall of man. Now, whilst the Prelude covers an entire lifetime of events for Wordsworth, and here's the contents page, which I always think is hilarious because this is this huge poem, but actually it's just divided into the sort of chronological events of his lifetime. And the extract that we're looking at comes from part 1, childhood and school time. But I just think it's funny, it looks like a sort of almost like an essay, the contents page. So it's not really focusing on one particular event, you could say. We need to think about, it covers an entire lifetime of events, but the major event of the poem can be seen as the spiritual growth of the poet, what he describes as his own kind of argument for why he is a poet. Now, within the full poem, The Prelude, there are some historical heroic events that are detailed. The poem does contain experiences that the poet has in the French Revolution, for example. But in the extract from the boat stealing episode, it's hard to see how the events detailed can be seen as epic. Or is it? We could say that the awakening understanding of the power of nature can be seen as such an important moment in the poet's life that he felt it was deserving of its inclusion in this epic poem. Similarly, we can ask ourselves, well, if there's got to be a heroic character in a poem, who is the hero in the extract? The boy who is scared doesn't seem to be very heroic. So we might say it's not necessarily in this extract the poet. In the wider poem, the whole Prelude, yes, it makes sense the poet is the hero, but we could say perhaps that nature personified is the hero in this extract. It's possible to see the hero as being nature and I'll talk about that a bit more later. So Milton's Paradise Lost actually ends with the line, "The world was all before them." And early in the prelude, Wordsworth writes, "The earth is all before me." That's a clear allusion, a clear literary reference to the Milton poem. Whereas Milton ends with Adam and Eve being cast out of Eden and into the fallen world, Wordsworth begins within that fallen world. And clearly, the poet was writing with Milton in mind. So this is important in helping us understand some of the poet's choices, not just the sort of epic poetry form, but also the use of blank verse. So blank verse is where the poem has no rhyme scheme, but it's written in iambic pentameter, where every line has 10 syllables with alternating stressed and unstressed syllables. Now, Milton's Paradise Lost was also written in iambic pentameter, and in Wordsworth's lifetime, the poetry of Milton was growing in popularity to the point that it became standard practice for all lengthy philosophical poetry to be written in blank verse. So if you're analysing the use of blank verse, you can explain that because of the influence of Milton, at the time, all lengthy poems that were philosophical were written in blank verse. And that's how we can use the understanding of the poetic influence of Milton and the use of the poetic form of the epic poem all links back to Milton, so it's crucial in helping us appreciate the blank verse and the epic poetry form that is employed. Little comment about structure then. You might be aware that the extract we're looking at consists of one long verse. There are no stanza changes, there are no verse breaks, and that's quite interesting. There are a couple of ideas behind that. Firstly, we need to consider the effect on the reader. When we read the whole poem aloud with no major breaks or pauses, we could argue that the reader is overwhelmed by the immensity of the poem. We're literally left breathless as we read through. And this overwhelming aspect reflects how the young Wordsworth himself was overwhelmed by his experience with nature. So the structure of the poem as one long verse helps the reader to empathise with and understand the emotions that the poet was going through at the moment, because it is one long breathless verse for us to read through. The structure does also link back to the influence of Milton. Paradise Lost was written in the same way, with these lengthy verses. There were verse breaks in the prelude, but you can see this is one verse, this is one stanza, so the breaks were not so frequent as we might expect. So let's go through the poem then. There's some points on form and structure. There'll be some more coming up as well, but let's just go through the poem, looking perhaps a little bit more now at language. So one summer evening, led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cave, its usual home. The first question is, who is her in this poem? When I first read this poem, I thought that it was a sort of love story, that he was out with his girlfriend and she sort of, took him to a little place for the boat. But that's not what's happening here. Her is actually nature. This is the personification of nature. And earlier on in the poem, before the extract, but earlier on in the prelude, we have this line: "Thanks to the means which nature deigned to employ, whether her fearless visitings or those." So we see that nature is the her in the poem. We only know that when we look at a part of the poem which isn't included in the extract. The feminine gender given is very interesting. The entire poem is often analysed in terms of the genders which are applied within it. The masculine oars, line, ridge and peak contrast the feminine boat, cave and lake. It's possible to give a Freudian interpretation of the poem, seeing the entire event steeped in sexual metaphor, but I'm not going to digress on that in this analysis. Perhaps I'll put a couple of links in the comment section if you're interested in exploring that. What I like to think about is, why is the poetic device of personification used when writing about nature? Personification, of course, the giving of human attributes to something that isn't human, the use of the pronoun her for something which actually doesn't have a gender in this case. What I think is particularly interesting at this point is that it doesn't seem that the poet intentionally set out to steal a boat. He's taken there by nature. That's his recollection of it. Now, One of the strange things to get your head around here is that this poem is, of course, written by the poet as an adult and probably tinkered with throughout his lifetime, as we know, looking back on an event that took place as a child. So, in some ways, the poem reflects the sort of childlike character, the childlike naivety and childlike thoughts of young Wordsworth. But in the other sense, we do see an adult perspective looking back on it. Okay, so a good example would be, did he know at the time as a child, did he think nature took him there? Or is it as an adult looking back on it, he felt this experience was essential and nature kind of made it happen? Just interesting to think about. You can notice the enjambment which is used. Now, enjambment is the continuation of a sentence beyond the end of a line. So the actual first sentence is 3 lines, but it continues over those lines. So, I found a little boat. Now, enjambment is an interesting poetic device, often used to suggest an overpowering urge to communicate, an inability to stop and order your thoughts into a coherent and ordered structure. Much like the fact that the extract consists of one long verse with no breaks, the enjambment adds to the sense of the overwhelming effect nature has upon the child. It's like he has to furiously blurt out and express the sort of story of what's happened, and it's not in this ordered kind of one sentence per line. The enjambment, the continuation, the overflow is much like the one long verse. So what happens is Straight Iron loosed her chain, and stepping in pushed from the shore. It was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure, nor within the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on. So what's happening here then is he takes the he finds the boat, he undoes the chain, he gets in and pushes off onto the lake. And some interesting things going on here. The boy unchains the boat and takes it onto the lake, and that's described as an act of stealth. Now, stealth is a particularly important word here. It has connotations of the boy being both sneaky and sly, the synonyms you see on the screen. So there's no doubt that the action is morally wrong. But the poet doesn't seem to be worried about that, and this is our first theme-linked analysis linked to the poem's presentation of man. In this opening of the poem, man is shown as selfish, taking whatever he wants with no thought of the consequences. This prideful attitude is further presented later in the poem, and I think what we can say about the poet's presentation of man is man, and as an extension of man's society, is made up of people who are proud, who take from nature, who take whatever they want, who feel that they are dominant and they are the kind of aggressor and they can take whatever they want, which is exactly what we see through the taking of the boat. This idea of man being proud then is seen not only in the taking of the boat, but a little bit later on in the poem as well, where we see this description of proud of his skill. So the pride which the boy feels ultimately is going to be washed away. He's going to be humbled by the mountaintop in a bit. But at the beginning, we can see the presentation of man as proud, perhaps arrogant, feeling that he is superior and can take whatever he wants. And that is actually presented in a number of ways throughout the poem. But I'll sort of deal with the poem chronologically and go through everything you need to know, rather than jump around and sort of lose where we're up to. What happens there is a very nice positive image, leaving behind her still on either side small circles glittering idly in the moon until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. Now what's going on here, and again you need to know a little bit about rowing I guess, is that if you picture the boy in the rowing boat with the 2 oars going over the side, the oars dip into the water, and as they dip into the water they cause these ripples, so there are ripples on either side. And the poet is just describing the boat on the water, but the imagery is deliberately positive. Circles glittering, sparkling light, they give a magical, almost celestial quality to the movement. And this positivity is going to lead to a greater contrast in later lines when things turn sinister. The use of present participles throughout the poem is important to look at. It began with stepping, leaving, now it's moved to the very positive glittering, sparkling, and there'll be a dramatic shift later on with the heaving that we move to when the negative experience takes place. And we can argue that the point we're at now is the high point, the climax of positivity in the poem. And the use of present participles reflects that. It's the glittering and sparkling is the sort of fantastic moment that we're actually going to shift away from once the sort of revelation of nature becomes clear. But now, like one who rose, proud of his skill to reach a chosen point with an unswerving line, I fixed my view upon the summit of a craggy ridge. The horizon's utmost boundary, far above, was nothing but the stars and the grey sky. So as I showed you in the picture earlier, what's happening is he's fixing his eyes on a point. And that point is that craggy ridge, that sort of low, uneven, rocky, cliff face. And there are a few interesting things going on here. There's more demonstration of the pride of man. We have, proud of his skill, but also the word chosen is significant. He feels completely in control. I will choose that point. I'm in complete control. He has this arrogance heading towards the point. He's chosen it. He is dominant. He is doing exactly as he pleased and exactly as he plans. So in literal terms, the next part of the poem is difficult to understand. As I said, when rowing, the rower faces backwards. He fixes his eyes on a point in the distance to keep in view, which helps him to row straight. And that point for the poet is this craggy ridge, a high point of uneven and rocky ground, which is in front of him. The sentence with its utmost boundary, this phrase, utmost boundary, it helps us to understand a lot of this poem. And one of the things about the extract is that it seems in literal terms to be more confusing than if you look at it in metaphorical terms, okay? So the utmost boundary. Now, when he's looking at the craggy ridge, he feels that that craggy ridge is the utmost boundary. In other words, the end point. Now, many students ask, why does the sudden appearance of the mountain a few lines later scare Wordsworth so much? But we have to realise, before witnessing the mountaintop, the poet wrongly assumes that the horizon's utmost boundary far above was nothing but the stars and the great sky. In other words, he thinks the craggy ridge is the much higher cliff face. He thinks that's the end of it. And the true shock then can be seen as one of self-realisation that the poet does not know everything. His self-pride is misplaced. We've seen that he's proud. We've seen this metaphor of the pride of man. But we realise there is much more to the world than he perceives. And taking this even further, we can see the message of this moment is that the realisation of how minute and unimportant human life is when contrasted with the vast array and the power and the dominance of nature. So that's why there's going to be this massive shock, because he thinks the small ridge is the utmost boundary. And that's a metaphor for man thinking they know everything, that they know the limits of everything, that they are supreme and powerful. Now the question here then arises, why did nature lead Wordsworth to take the boat if her plan all along was to frighten and humble him? You see, at the beginning, Wordsworth says that he was led by nature. And now we realise that what's going to happen is going to be, scared and shocked, which is still part of nature's plan, presumably. So what is nature trying to achieve? And Wordsworth is pointing out that nature is going to show him the problem of what is referred to as the mean and vulgar works of man. And this again comes from a little bit later in the poem. So it's not in the extract, but it's important to help you with your understanding of what the themes are. Okay, so the notion that man is inherently bad leaves the reader open to the idea that nature can have a positive, redemptive impact on mankind. In essence, man needs to realise there is a power in the world that they cannot control. And then we have this bit. She was an elfin she was an elfin pinnace. Lustily I dipped my oars into the silent lake, and as I rode upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan. When from behind that craggy steep, till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct, upreared its head. Now this is the turning point in the poem. This is where everything starts to shift. Okay, to begin with, let's look at the imagery at the beginning. You'll notice very, very positive imagery, very elaborate and expressive imagery, such as elfin pinnace. Now, a lot of people don't know what that means, so let's have a look at it. To begin with, the pinnace is a light sailing vessel. It's a sailing ship. And it's interesting that the little boat from line 2 has now grown in the poet's mind to an elfin pinnace. So if a pinnace is a light sailing ship, the adjective elfin imbues a sense of magic to the scene. You know, a boat like the one we see on the screen here, like something from Lord of the Rings that Legolas would have. The whole thing has taken on the mythical nature so important to epic poetry. And the experience is so amazing for the poet that it's taken on a mythical quality. But we can again see the growing pride of the poet, who now exaggerates the moment in his arrogance. He feels like he is, you know, on this amazing ship. It's just like he's sort of, exaggerating for effect. And then there's this massive shift in the poem, and everything that goes beyond this point can be compared to everything that goes after it. It's really interesting, everything that goes before to everything that goes after it. Okay, so the syntax of this section is really interesting. You need to know a little bit about grammar, so sentence structure. The most common sentence structure is what we call SVO, subject, verb, object. Andrew loves Claire is a sentence. The verb in a sentence is the doing word, the action that's taking place, in other words, love. The subject is the thing or the person that is doing the verb, so in this case Andrew, because it's Andrew who's loving. And the object, which is optional by the way in a simple sentence, is the thing or the person that is having the verb done to it, in this sentence Claire. So SVO is the sort of basic sentence structure that we work with. Now, this whole section is one long sentence, and we've got lots of different things going on in it. But what I want to look at is when, from here, from the word when onwards, and this is where the poet reveals the big cliff face beyond the craggy steep, which is of course the whole kind of climax of the poem, realizing that there is more to the scene than the boy thought. He thought he had fixed his eyes on the end point, and realizing behind that is this huge peak, and that being a metaphor for realizing that man's ideas about the world are wrong and limited and that kind of thing, and nature is powerful and dominant and all the rest of it. So this is the big moment of the poem. Okay, now with that in mind, the sentence structure here deliberately drags out the revelation of what's happening. So if we look at SVO, subject, verb, object, the sentence can be read, or the latter part of the sentence, we could think of the subject being the huge peak, the verb being upreared, and the object being its head. But there's this huge delay from the word when. So this could have just said, when a huge peak upreared its head, and that would have been an SVO, subject, and sentence, and that would have been absolutely fine. But what we see is the deliberate, delayed reveal of both the subject and the verb. Okay, so after the word when, we have the extra information used, added to delay the moment and heighten suspense. So from behind that craggy steep till then the horizon's bound, and we're reading that thinking, skip that, I want to know what, when what, and then we get the explanation, a huge peak. And then before we see the verb, we see more delay, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct, before we are made aware of the verb. So the revelation of the subject and the revelation of the verb is delayed. And the sentence structure here employed by Wordsworth increases the tension and suspense. It allows the reader to empathize with how the poet was feeling, the tension and the kind of fear inherent in the moment for the poet. The whole sentence as well, as I talked about earlier with the enjambment, the whole sentence becomes breathtaking to read, which again reflects the intensity of the moment for the poet. Okay, so the structural use of one long verse in this extract, the structural use of enjambment, the structural use of this huge, long, elaborate sentence, all of it makes the reader breathless and kind of overwhelmed and reflects the intensity and the sort of overwhelming feeling being experienced by the poet. It's very, very clever. Now, given the fact that the poet has used personification throughout the poem, don't you think it's interesting? So nature and the boat and her, and one of the things was described as his as well, wasn't it? Yeah, like one who rose proud of his skill. So there was a lot of personification, but the personification now disappears. The lack of personification used to describe the cliff, which is now labelled it, is important, particularly when we contrast it with the previous moments where there was personification, because at this moment the poet loses his power. He loses his ability to define things as he wants. He no longer has the power with the cliff face, and the sudden shift in pronouns shows the shock that he's feeling. He feels vastly different to how he was feeling as he was rowing out with his pride and his arrogance, and he is essentially losing his vocabulary. And this is something which is repeated now in 3 or 4 different examples. So let's have a look at it. The poet's use of huge peak is similar to the use of it. The ambitious and expressive vocabulary has deserted him. Only a few lines before we had the imagistic simile like a swan, which suggested the grace and dignity of the boat. Now the poet is in such a state of shock, he regresses to a simplistic definition of what he sees before him, a huge peak. And we even have this repetition of huge. Now this is one of the most amazing things in this poem. A huge peak, black and huge. Now that sounds like something that I would say to a kind of a year 7 student. Don't repeat yourself. You've repeated the word huge twice there. Think of a different word. The poet is deliberately doing this. The ambitious and expressive vocabulary has deserted him. Now, this is so clever because the repetition of huge is so shocking to us as a reader. It's repetition for effect. The poet's confidence, his pride and vocabulary has left him. He's basically stuttering here as he's unable to kind of put words to the experience that he is experiencing, for want of a better word. I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars, and still, for so it seemed with purpose of its own and measured motion like a living thing, strode after me. So here the poet is essentially losing his grip on reality. He is feeling like the mountain has a purpose of its own and that it's striding after him. Now notice the disclaimer here. I always think this is interesting, perhaps evidence of the fact that it was written as an adult looking back on it. Look at the disclaimer, so it seemed. As an adult, Wordsworth is very aware of the fact that, of course, the mountain wasn't chasing after him. It didn't come after him. From the benefit of adulthood, from where he writes the poem, he knows that what he thought was happening was not happening. The mountain wasn't chasing him. But still, there's this massive intensity, more personification now, and this might add to the how this poem could be seen as a heroic, an epic poem, because it has this sort of mythical quality now taking over the poem. With trembling oars I turned, and through the silent water stole my way back to the covert of the willow tree. So the poet is scared. He's rowed out onto the lake. He's seen this huge mountaintop from beyond what he thought was the sort of highest point, the boundary of sight. Up behind it now, as he rows further out, his perspective is lengthened. He sees the huge mountaintop. It scares him. Metaphorically, it scares him because he realizes that that mankind does not know everything and is not as dominant and powerful and all the rest of it as he thinks. So what he does is he turns around, he turns the boat around and goes back to the willow tree. A lot of the poems in the Prelude, a lot of the stories are cyclical. They sort of start somewhere and end up there as well. And we can see here the word stole appearing again in the poem. And this links to the word stealth from line 5, but whereas stealth reflected the arrogance of the poet in the opening, the poet now is frightened, and stole suggests sort of a desperation and a fear. He returns back to where the boat was originally tied up. There in her mooring place I left my bark, and through the meadows homeward went, in grave and serious mood. The poet leaves the boat where he found it, he goes home, he's very unhappy, he's very depressed, and the use of grave and serious again is another example of this unspecific, vague language, particularly when we compare to the emotions already detailed within the poem. The vague language used by the poet reflects the enormity of what's happened, he's unable to articulate it. And then we have the ending of the poem. But after I had seen that spectacle for many days, my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. Over my thoughts there hung a darkness, call it solitude or blank desertion. No familiar shapes remained, no pleasant images of trees or of sea or sky, no colours of green fields, but huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men, move slowly through the mind by day and were a trouble to my dreams. Now, what you'll find with poems, when they are narrative poems, often, poems that tell a true story from a poet's life, they tend to be quite easy to understand until the end. And it's almost like at the end, the poet wants to get across the kind of important message and make sure that we understand, there is a kind of a theme behind this. So this ending is pretty problematic. I mean, what's really happening is that days afterwards, the poet is unable to shake off the darkness of his thoughts. Everything he thought he knew and the familiar shapes have gone. The dim and undetermined sense of the unknown, again, is an example of vague language employed by the poet to so brilliantly describe the feeling of shock that he is experiencing. Even when he says darkness, call it solitude, it's almost like he is struggling to describe what happens to him to the point where he's saying, well, it could be called this, we could call it that. He can't even put a word on it at this point. And again, this vague language can be compared to the very specific language in the opening half of the poem, which highlights the transition the poet has gone through. Really important, the repetition of the use of the word no. There's no familiar shapes, no pleasant images of trees, of sky, no colours of green fields. The use of the word no, the repetition of the word no, makes us very aware of the fact that the poet now realises that there is so much that he doesn't know. And I tell you what I really like about this bit about the use of the word no. It's like the pride he had in the opening lines has vanished. He's not only not confident now of what he knows, he actually is only able to explain things in terms of what he doesn't know, hence the repetition of no. So he can no longer explain what's happening, he can just explain what isn't happening. He is really unable to define exactly what's happening. So everything has changed for the poet, who is really being forced to reflect upon everything he thought he knew because he's realized that his themes were limited and finite. And if we bring it back to the themes of the poem, views of man, nature and society, we can lump man and society together really and say that, man and society in this extract are condemned as prideful and arrogant, as seen through the depiction of the poet in the first half of the poem. Nature is described as being powerful and terrifying, and through man's experience of nature, he's reminded of his lack of importance and superiority in the world. Mankind does not have control over nature. Nature has control over mankind. So that's what the poem is telling us, or the extract from the poem. Well done for getting to the end of the video, guys. It would really help me if you give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. As you can imagine, I took about, I would say, 12 to 15 hours to prepare this poem. You've done very well to watch the video. Pick up the ebook and yeah, subscribe to the channel, and I'll do analysis like this on every poem by the time we get to the exams.